There is only one thing worse than a rapist. Boom.
A child.
No.
We're gonna frame you for murder, and you're gonna go to jail for 30 years.
What the bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone.
Gravediggers.
Hey everyone, it's your favorite friendly neighborhood Amr.
And it is Erin, and welcome to another episode of Das Kriminal.
Your favorite duo are at it again, speaking directly into your ears.
Yeah, so do you want to just get right into it, Amr?
Let's do this, yeah.
So when we started this podcast, we made it a goal to interrogate the meaning of crime and problematize the roles of police and the prison system, both in the true crime genre and in our respective communities. So presently, thanks to the tireless work of Black activists, writers, and organizers, as well as hundreds of thousands of protesters demanding change, we are finally at a critical point where more people than ever are beginning to understand police and prison abolition as a necessary step toward justice and safety for Black and Indigenous communities.
So in this episode in particular, we want to investigate the investigation itself, a function of law enforcement that's often uncritically glorified in those propaganda television shows like Law & Order, CSI, and yes, even one of my favorite shows, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. In the Radical Glossary, Police, a Field Guide, which we highly recommend by the way, David Correa and Tyler Wall explain, quote, "The special ability police claim in solving crime through investigation is celebrated as among their most important activities. The investigative power of the police is where the criminal justice system begins. Investigation conjures images of grizzled detectives stalking criminal perps and suspects, chasing down leads and sniffing out clues, or scientific crime scene investigators combing through crime scenes, collecting DNA samples and piecing together evidence. But this is merely a Hollywood fantasy that police are happy to cultivate," end quote.
Please be aware that in this episode, we will have mentions of violence, including rape, as it is relevant to the investigations we're going to discuss. While we don't go into graphic detail, we want our listeners to always be informed of any content that might be particularly upsetting and exercise your own discretion.
Yeah, and we also want to warn you that this episode is extraordinarily infuriating. We talk about injustice and unfairness all the time on Das Kriminal, so that's nothing new. But something about this episode is just very enraging and viscerally upsetting. So if you're maybe just about to take a bath or cooking a nice dinner for yourself and your partner, or dinner for two just for yourself, listen, I don't judge, perhaps set this episode aside for another time because it really does put you in an angry mood.
Yeah, Amr and I spent this last week just angrily texting back and forth about the content in this episode. Like, could you believe this? And it just gets worse and worse.
You know how people say life is unfair? And it's like, yeah, life is unfair, but this is just beyond that. It's just atrocious.
Yeah, and I think some people have personality traits, and I'm definitely one of them, and I think you are too, Amr, where unfairness, especially obvious unfairness, really bothers me, and I'm compelled to do something.
Oh, absolutely. I get very angry when I see something that I think is unfair. It's one of those things that really boils my blood. Like, I viscerally feel upset, like uncomfortable, you know?
Yeah, so I can just picture some people listening to this and like sitting in a chair with your arms crossed or angrily breaking a pencil or something. So just be aware.
Yes, yeah.
So let's begin. On January 22nd, 1987, a woman in her 20s was visiting a shopping mall in Huntington, West Virginia, when she was abducted by a stranger in the parking lot. The masked man drove her to a secluded area where he robbed her and repeatedly raped her. Less than a month later, on February 16, 1987, an almost identical horror happened to another woman at the same shopping mall. She was kidnapped from the parking lot, robbed, and raped by someone covering his face with a ski mask. These two women, Rebecca Mowry Hobson and Janet Johnson Smith, had been attacked by the same man. Huntington police collected physical evidence from the scenes and began searching for a suspect. They soon zeroed in on Glen Woodall, a 29-year-old groundskeeper at the Whitechapel Memorial Gardens Cemetery near the Huntington Mall. He was arrested on March 6, 1987, and indicted and arraigned shortly after. According to the Innocence Project, quote, "The prosecution's evidence against Woodall included a partial identification by one of the victims, an identification of the clothing seized from Woodall's house, and an identification of a smell common to the perpetrator and Woodall's workplace," end quote. Additionally, crime scene investigators had collected hairs, which were then compared to Glen Woodall's hair. Fred Zain, the officer in charge of West Virginia's Criminal Identification Bureau's serology section, testified that the hairs were a match, claiming that it was, quote, "highly unlikely that the hair could have originated from anyone else," end quote. He also recorded that conventional serology, or bodily fluid, comparisons could not exclude Woodall.
Glen Woodall maintained his innocence, but the forensic evidence was a slam dunk for this prosecution. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before issuing a guilty verdict, and Woodall was sentenced to life without mercy, plus 335 years, meaning he would spend the rest of his life in prison. However, as technology advanced, Woodall kept pushing from his prison cell for forensic evidence at the crime scene to be tested against his own DNA. At first, the West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals rejected these requests, but with the help of Woodall's lawyers and involvement from the Innocence Project, the samples were finally retested. The Innocence Project confirms, quote, "PCR testing was performed on spermatozoa found in the rape kits. The DQ alpha types from both samples matched each other, but excluded Woodall. The results were duplicated by another laboratory with the same results." End quote. In other words, Rebecca Mowry Hobson and Janet Johnson Smith had been raped by the same man, but that man was not Glen Woodall.
Woodall was officially exonerated on May 5, 1992, after serving 5 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and received a $1 million settlement from the state. Despite independently tested DNA evidence proving Woodall's innocence, West Virginia prosecutors still insisted to the victims that they had caught the right guy. Rebecca Mowry Hobson remembers, quote, "Even after they released Woodall, I had felt like he was responsible and got away from it. I just couldn't comprehend how they could get life in prison without parole on someone that didn't commit the crime. And when they dropped the charges, the prosecutor at the time had told me they felt sure that they had convicted the right man. They just didn't have the evidence they needed to retry him at that time, and they could come back at a later date and do so. So for years, I continued hating this man, believing that he did this," end quote.
But in 2009, the DNA samples implicated another man, who was already in prison for a murder committed in 1992, one Donald Eugene Good. In 2011, Good was convicted on 16 counts of sexual assault, 2 counts of sexual abuse, and 2 counts of kidnapping. It might seem in this case that justice was finally served. Woodall was exonerated, and Good was eventually convicted for the rapes he committed against Janet and Rebecca. But something struck the lawyers and analysts at the Innocence Project as strange. How is it that forensic evidence, which originally secured Woodall's conviction, would then exonerate him?
The Innocence Project began digging into the cases of West Virginia's leading serologist, Mr. Frederick Salem Zain, who had by then moved on to Bexar County, Texas. And what they found should horrify us all. So let's talk a little bit about forensic science. If you've seen the Innocence Files on Netflix, or the Last Week Tonight with John Oliver segment on forensic science, you likely already know that a lot of forensic investigation isn't even science at all. Oliver notes that a 2009 report by the National Academy of Sciences found that many components of forensics, quote, "do not meet the fundamental requirements of science," end quote. The report explains that such methods, quote, typically lack mandatory and enforceable standards which are founded on rigorous research and testing, certification requirements, and accreditation programs. End quote.
In fact, the Innocence Project calculates that the misapplication of forensic science contributed to 45% of wrongful convictions in the United States, which, like Glen Woodall's, were later overturned through DNA evidence. Practices that you might have seen on police-based procedural dramas and taken for granted had scientific validity, like microscopic hair analysis, comparative bullet lead analysis, and bite mark identification, are actually total bunk.
The Innocence Project elaborates that the so-called expert testimony of forensic scientists can be misleading. Michigan State University College of Law professor Barbara O'Brien explains to the New York Times, quote, "A lot of the problem with forensic testimony is that the diagnosticity is overstated. Evidence gets dressed up with the scientific certainty that isn't justified." End quote. By this she means, forensic experts will often testify that a hair sample, for instance, has a 1 in 1 million chance of belonging to anyone other than the suspect. But those numbers are not scientifically verified. It could be 1 in 1 million, or 1 in 1,000, or 1 in 10.
So the stats course I'm taking right now actually delves into this quite a bit, not the forensics part, but the verification of science per se. So any test result is only as valid as the process that yields it, which makes sense, but the way it works is interesting. So scientists would determine an acceptable level of error before an experiment, which is called the alpha level, and then calculate their experimental data, a p-value. They assign a p-value to this experimental data. The p-value is the probability that the experimental data they observed is accurate given an assumed null hypothesis. If that p-value is lower than the alpha level, then they reject the null hypothesis. If the p-value is above this alpha level, which is arbitrarily determined, either it's a 5% or 1%, usually it's 5, but depending on which science you're in, it can be 1%. The objectivity of science could be interrogated based on this because a lot of papers published, even in journals like Nature or Science, these are like major journals. If you actually dig into them, they're basically bunk. The paper's authors will find ways to bend and twist numbers to fit a conclusion. And we've talked about this before in terms of incentivizing publication. But you see this as well with common news stories. So you'll have like the BBC or something come out with an article that says like, oh, did you know that chocolate actually leads to weight loss? Or like coffee is really good for you or whatever. And if you actually analyze the data, it's like the sample sizes were manipulated or outliers were cut out, stuff like that, that it's easy to make data fit your conclusion just by toying with the numbers a little bit.
Right. And then it so often turns out that those studies that say chocolate or coffee or whatever is good for you are funded by Nestle.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So we've talked about this before on our mini episodes, but of course, science can be valid, but human beings make mistakes all the time. And hence, the work of scientists, just like the work of law enforcement or lawyers or any other profession, needs to be read with a critical eye.
On the one hand, they make mistakes, but on the other hand, they have motives that can be conflicting with objectivity or with like the greater good or whatever.
Exactly. So John Oliver similarly points out that expert witnesses will use this really misleading phrase. They'll say, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, which even the Department of Justice acknowledges has, quote, no scientific meaning and may mislead fact finders, jurors, or judges when deciding whether guilt has been proved beyond a reasonable doubt, end quote.
And the fact that these experts can exaggerate or mislead jurors with their testimony is absolutely terrifying. The difference between reasonably certain and absolutely certain is pretty fucking big when the rest of someone's life is on the table. I mean, for me personally, if you gave me a gun and said that you're pretty reasonable that it's empty versus absolutely certain it's empty. If you're reasonably certain it's empty, I'm still not going to test it out. I'm not going to try it by shooting at you. The difference in degree is actually quite remarkable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these experts or scientists, they're humans. And like we said, humans make mistakes. Evidence can get mixed up or misplaced, lab equipment can be faulty, human error is inevitable. And we need to take precautions like testing evidence multiple times at different sites, like different labs, to ensure that these mistakes don't cost innocent people their freedom.
But perhaps the most frightening thing is that, in many cases, the faulty evidence that leads to wrongful convictions is not a mistake. According to a 2019 article by Heather Murphy of the New York Times, quote, "The leading culprit in convicting innocent people was official misconduct, according to the report by the National Registry of Exonerations. Nearly 1/3 of these cases involved a police corruption scheme in Chicago through which a police officer framed individuals on drug charges." End quote. Yes, you heard that right. The number one cause of wrongful conviction is misconduct by law enforcement. In the Chicago scandal specifically, Police Sergeant Ronald Watts and his lackey, Officer Khalat Muhammad, extorted mostly poor Black men around the Ida B. Wells housing project for protection money. If the men didn't pay up, Watts and his team planted drugs on them and arrested them for possession. Since the racket has been uncovered, 63 people have been exonerated. Some of them spent years in prison due to these frame jobs. Lawyer Joshua Tepfer notes of the victims of the scheme, quote, "One thing that goes without saying is the reason they were covered up is they were viewed as a disposable people who live in the housing projects. Nobody cared, nobody believed them." End quote. Racism in the criminal justice system is extremely apparent in cases of wrongful convictions. Innocent Black people are 3.5 times more likely than white people to be wrongfully convicted of sexual assault and 12 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of drug crimes. Furthermore, the sentences for Black people are routinely higher for the same crimes.
Additionally, though defendants in the United States are entitled to an attorney, they aren't necessarily entitled to a good one. Public defenders are often overworked and inexperienced and might encourage innocent people to accept a plea deal rather than spend the time adequately analyzing the evidence and researching a good defense.
And the costs of legal defense tactics like independent laboratory testing, private investigators, psychiatrists, and expert witnesses on their side can be prohibitively expensive for many people. The ACLU notes that of the people currently sitting on death row, quote, "Virtually all are poor, a significant number are mentally disabled, more than 40% are African American, and a disproportionate number are Native American, Latino, and Asian." End quote.
I do want to point out here that this sort of dual system is a function and pretty much a feature of having a system where you have a public institution side by side with private institutions, which basically allows people with money, the more money people have, the better service they get, because public services will always be underfunded and overworked compared to private entities. And this is just one symptom of it. You see it with schools, you see it with hospitals, you see it with any government service that has to exist alongside private entities, means that those private entities, by virtue of charging more and thus having more money to spend on more resources, means that you have this class segregation where how much money you have can determine your access to things like how good your school is, how good your hospital is, and in this case, how good your lawyers are when it comes to public defense. And we have to analyze how overworked these public defenders are. And if you're overworked and have 10 cases at once or whatever, I don't know how much numbers constitute an overworked public defender, but I understand why you'd be pushing your client to take a plea deal, because you just don't have the time and energy to research because you're so overworked, because the public system is so underfunded.
Right.
So back to our friend Fred Zain. Glen Woodall, the wrongfully convicted man we discussed earlier in this episode, is white, as were the victims and the real perpetrator behind those heinous attacks. But he was certainly working class and couldn't afford a stellar defense like O.J. Simpson's Dream Team or Ted Kennedy's Master Fixer. In Woodall's case, defense requests for a more comprehensive DNA analysis and comparisons were repeatedly denied. Instead, all the forensic evidence shown at trial supported Woodall's guilt, as serologist Fred Zain testified that it was highly unlikely that the hair found at the crime scene could have come from anyone other than Glen Woodall.
But after Woodall's exoneration, the Innocence Project and the county prosecutor began to take a deeper look at Fred Zain and some of his past work. They noted that Zain had earned a reputation as a serologist who could crack even the most difficult cases, and that police and prosecutors from all over West Virginia reached out to him for his analysis and testimony. One prosecutor even referred to Zain as a god.
Now, anyone who actually works in science, as I did for a while myself, will tell you that this is a huge red flag. Good science, quote unquote, is that which can be tested and proven over and over again. If a scientist consistently gets results that nobody else in the field can replicate, that's usually a very bad sign. I can tell you now that there are ample articles published in scientific journals that, even though those journals are so-called reputable journals, the articles themselves are not replicable. Even though, the core principle of the scientific method states that the results have to be reproducible to be valid.
As you've probably already figured out, a lot of Fred Zain's forensic analysis didn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. In fact, Fred Zain wasn't the scientist he claimed to be at all. It turns out he had been hired in 1977 at the West Virginia State Police Crime Lab, partially on the basis of his minor in chemistry. But Fred Zain didn't minor in chemistry. He majored in biology and graduated with a C average, and flunked or barely passed the few chemistry courses he did take. What's more, he also failed an FBI course in forensics. He is literally less qualified in chemistry than our very own Amr.
Okay, this part irrationally frustrated me, genuinely infuriated me, because he's basically stealing chemist valor. He's doing to chemists what people would do. People would wear troop uniforms and put fake troop medals to get discounts at Applebee's or whatever. This is the equivalent, but for chemistry. And I didn't go through 4 years of fucking hell in chemistry, and my grades basically went down and then up again, so this fucking imbecile can fake a chemistry degree.
And it's also just infuriating that this man who lied about minoring in chemistry for one thing, but who also lied a lot in general and put innocent people away, is less qualified in all of that than Amr, who is using his chemistry skills to do a podcast.
I'm a man of the people. What can you say? I serve the people.
Fred, just buy a microphone, go on your way. You don't have to do this.
But also, I don't understand. Do these people not check? Can I write on my resume that I have 5 degrees? If you apply and you say something, surely the human resources, whatever, the people who interviewed him should have verified.
I don't know. I just applied. Well, I am taking another job in another country. I'm not going to say where, but I had to send an apostilled version of my diploma to these people. I had to have the government verify, and they called my university and said, did Erin go here? Did she graduate this year? Did she get this GPA? And that's not for a position where I can put people in prison.
But it actually gets worse. In 1985, 2 years before the Woodall case, an FBI laboratory director warned the West Virginia State Police that Fred Zain was not a credible serologist after he failed some basic forensics courses. Later that year, 2 other workers in the lab reported that they had seen Zain record results from blank test plates. But nobody in West Virginia law enforcement or the crime lab took any action against Zain. For over a decade, Fred Zain had been engaged in misconduct and outright fraud in West Virginia and later in Texas. He filed reports on tests he's never done, falsified lab results, marked negative tests as positive, or inconclusive results as conclusive, and reported scientifically implausible results. In some cases, he reported positive matches for tests that his lab didn't even have the necessary equipment to perform.
Oh my god, that is enraging.
If this wasn't so infuriating and affected so many people in such a harmful way, I'd have to respect this guy's laziness. In any other field, if he was just some schmuck in a university, massive respect for your laziness, sir.
Oh, yeah. If he was just someone analyzing, I don't know, shit and being like, yeah, there were larvae in it, I'd be like, okay.
Yeah, like, respect, man.
But as a result, those who audited Fred Zain's work in West Virginia believe that as many as 134 people may have been wrongfully convicted because of his falsified forensic reports and testimony. A few people who have been exonerated after Fred Zain's perjury incarcerated them are Glen Woodall, of course, whose case prompted a closer look at Fred Zain's laboratory. He was exonerated after serving 5 years in prison. Gerald and Dewey Davis, who each served 8 years for a sexual assault and kidnapping. Gilbert Alejandro, who served 4 years for aggravated sexual assault. William Odell Harris, who served 8 years for second-degree sexual assault. And Jimmy Gardner, who served 26 years for robbery and sexual assault.
Now, each of these cases is very egregious. Jimmy Gardner's circumstances are especially appalling. In 1984, he was in West Virginia with a baseball farm team and had a strong possibility of eventually pitching for the Chicago Cubs. Meanwhile, someone described a light-skinned black man around 6'1", robbing and raping an elderly woman and her daughter. Gardner is dark-skinned and 6'4", but investigators took DNA from every black player on the baseball team, presumably to eliminate them as suspects. Instead, Fred Zain selected Gardner as a perpetrator and pinned the crime on him. Gardner was sentenced to 33 to 100 years. He described his time in prison as slavery and said he would often just go to his cell, cry, and pray.
It turns out the actual rapist had type O blood and Jimmy Gardner has type A, a distinction that serologists in 1984 would have been able to make. It looks like Fred Zain would just lie to put innocent people in prison. Whether he falsified evidence because he personally believed they were guilty, or wanted to help police and prosecutors look good, or wanted to seem better at his job than he really was, or some combination of these things, we'll probably never know, because Fred Zain died from cancer in Florida in 2002 without criminal charges ever being filed against him. And here's something that will scare you shitless if you're not entirely panicked already. Fred Zain isn't the only rogue serologist who was doing this sort of thing. Joyce Gilchrist of the Oklahoma City Police Department was accused of falsifying evidence in order to help prosecutors. Her results and testimony contributed to 23 people being sentenced to death, 12 of whom have already been executed. Like with Fred Zain, law enforcement in Oklahoma routinely reached out to Gilchrist for their cases because she could achieve results that, marvelously, nobody else could. Police and prosecutors even referred to her as Black Magic because of this, and presumably because Joyce herself was black, which is just a bad nickname all around.
Gilchrist's work first came under the microscope in 2001 after similar circumstances to Glen Woodall and Fred Zain. A man by the name of Jeffrey Pierce spent 15 years in prison for a rape and robbery he did not do after Gilchrist had testified that his hair matched at that crime scene. With help from the Innocence Project and independent DNA testing, Pierce was exonerated. Joyce Gilchrist was dismissed from her position at the forensics lab but was never criminally charged.
And Pierce wasn't the only victim of Gilchrist's fraud. Like with Fred Zain, there are several people who have been exonerated, and who knows how many more still in prison because of Gilchrist's false testimony. In the case of Johnny Edward Tallbear, an indigenous man who is a member of the Iowa Nation, Gilchrist testified that his blood matched that at a crime scene. It did not, and Tallbear was exonerated in 2018 after spending 26 years incarcerated. Moving over to Boston, a chemist and drug analyst named Annie Ducan admitted to falsifying evidence that could have affected up to 34,000 cases. She reported, for instance, that drug tests came back positive when she hadn't actually tested them, which could lead in many cases for people to be sent to prison, lose their jobs, or have their children taken away.
Now, up until this point, we focused on cases where the person was incarcerated and the revelations of those tampered evidence tests basically, facilitated the release. But I think it's also important at this point to note how life-destroying a conviction of guilt in the US and elsewhere can be. Not only are people sent to prison for obscene amounts of times, but should they be released, many jobs and homes for rent would request criminal background checks. Further, they may never be reunited with their children. So essentially, their life is burnt to the ground. These are for people who went to prison for some crime or another. They were convicted, sent to jail, and then they served their full time or they were released on probation for good behavior. And so they were supposedly reintegrated into society. But if their initial conviction stemmed from one of these false evidence or botched evidence tests and quote unquote professional testimony, I think it's horrifying that even after being released, the fact that their conviction isn't overturned or they're not exonerated means that they're looking at a very, 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 very limited life. It's a meager existence, a bleak existence. There's not much for them going.
Yeah, I feel like we should note here too, this episode in particular is really about innocent people being exonerated. But even if someone is guilty, like neither of us believe that their life should be ruined. You are not the worst thing that you've ever done.
Yeah, exactly. I don't believe in the sort of punitive carceral system that punishes people, like the sort of biblical punishment model. But even if that's the case, surely if someone serves their sentence and serves out their punishment, they should be allowed to reintegrate into society fully and not be hamstrung with all these absurd limitations.
Yeah, I also find it ridiculous that in many states, people with a felony on their record are unable to vote. That's disenfranchisement, and it's obviously racially targeted too.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned that because a lot of states or counties or whatever will vie to have prisons built in their area because the prison population can count for the number of representatives in Congress, but the prisoners can't vote. So you have the numbers, but they can't vote, so you could put whoever you want in there to swing the balance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and why can't prisoners vote? Why?
Yeah, that's I don't get it. Like, any self-respecting progressive candidate should come out and say, yes, every single prisoner should have the right to vote.
There's something about this, about Annie Ducan's falsification of these drug tests, where I see this image of someone in court insisting that they haven't used drugs while the prosecutor and the judge are like, well, the drug test says that you did. And this person is hauled off to jail or something. It's just so haunting and upsetting.
Yeah, and there's another thing you mentioned in the text, like we were talking about in the text conversation, where imagine if the prosecution is claiming that you raped those women and the DNA tests or the sperm tests or whatever match, quote unquote, and you're supposedly the rapist. And your defense are basically like, well, we can argue that, the sex was consensual. And you keep insisting, you're like, I've never met these people. I've never seen them. I've never met them. And the defense is like, you're not making my job any easier. But it must be so frustrating being the one that knows I never met these people.
Yeah, and regardless, you look like a liar because your first defense, which is true, is I've never assaulted anyone. I don't know what you're talking about. And then law enforcement says, well, the DNA says you did. And most defense lawyers would probably try to take the route that the sex was consensual. And that defense is wholly problematic on its own front in many ways. But you, the defendant, would probably be insisting, no, I never had sex with these people, consensual or otherwise. And to a jury, they would see that as like, oh, well, he's a liar. He's obviously lying.
Yeah, you either look like a liar or downright insane, and neither are good for you. It's just...
I would see it that way. Until doing an amount of research for this episode and really looking into how law enforcement lies sometimes, I would have been like, oh, well, they found his DNA on the victim. Case closed.
Yeah, if I was in the jury, I would definitely push for a guilty verdict because I'm like, yeah, well, the DNA says he was there and his sperm was there, so surely he's the one.
Right, and then say if the sex was consensual, why would he lie and say, I don't know her?
Exactly.
So, like Fred Zain, Annie Ducan, the drug tester in Boston, falsified her academic credentials, reporting that she held a master's degree in chemistry when she did not. And Annie was mysteriously 5 times more productive in her sample testing than anyone else in the lab, despite the fact that her coworkers rarely actually saw her doing work.
Red flag, red flag, red flag.
I don't know how many times we have to say it during this episode. If a scientist can magically produce results that seem too good to be true, it's because something is wrong. Annie Ducon was charged with obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, perjury, and falsification of academic records, and served a few years in prison. So while it might be the case that DNA doesn't lie, as I'm sure you've heard fucking Elliot Stabler say 5,000 times, law enforcement certainly does. And just because police say they have evidence, be it forensic or otherwise, doesn't mean we should automatically believe them. A couple things stand out to me in these cases that I want to discuss. First, it's mind-boggling to me that someone like Jimmy Gardner would spend decades in prison after Fred Zain was revealed to be a charlatan. If a lab technician's work is discredited, and that work has or could have led to wrongful convictions, why is that evidence not immediately re-examined? It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, and I mean, it's just appalling how, the numbers of the cases that they might have affected. 34,000 cases in the case of one of those people is a lot of cases, and having to go back and test each one over and over again, fucking hell, man.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily expensive, which is part of why the state doesn't want to do it. And even setting aside our larger criticisms of the prison system, it's absolutely enraging that any person could presently be incarcerated while there is now good reason to believe that evidence against them was fabricated. It's also ridiculous to expect incarcerated people to be able to pay to retest that evidence.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying about how having a system that's dependent on people's ability to pay some amount of money, it's built in to disenfranchise people who can't pay.
Yeah, and pretty much in all of these cases, the evidence was only eventually retested because these prisoners wrote to everyone from the Innocence Project to state officials like the governor and such, pleading their innocence. I can't imagine how that must feel, how gaslighted they must feel, how dehumanized they must feel, being put in a cage. That is, I just don't have the words.
Yeah, I mean, I think Aaron and I both agree that the carceral system for guilty people is barbaric enough as it is. It's awful, it's terrible, and it's completely counterproductive. Imagine being innocent and everyone around you telling you you're guilty and this is what you deserve.
And Jimmy Gardner, whose case we discussed, he is now an activist and runs a program which helps formerly incarcerated people reintegrate into society, regardless of guilt or innocence. That is what he's dedicated the rest of his life to. So that should really tell you something.
Yeah.
Additionally, I think we need to question why investigators like laboratory technicians are part of the police at all. Shouldn't labs operate independently from the police so that technicians don't know the details of the crime as to not, possibly bias their work? Just, put a number on it and say, here's a sample. Does it match or not?
This is a really, really good point because I've seen it arise in a lot of those procedural cop shows where you see these lab techs being sort of best friends with the detectives, the prosecutors, and the lab techs are just one big happy freak family. I saw it with lab tech Abby in NCIS and with the people in CSI, people in fucking Law and Order. And it just genuinely boggles my mind that the prosecution, police, and forensics can intertwine so intensely in terms of being part of a social circle without anyone raising the issue of a conflict of interest.
Yeah, well, first, it is just appalling how investigators, like we discussed earlier, would request Fred Zain and Joyce Gilchrist to look at their cases because those people got results that they favored more often. How could anyone not be like, wow, that is probably a sign something is fucked up here?
I mean, investigators just want to close cases and make guilty. Prosecutors just want their numbers to look good. And lab techs are so intertwined in the system because, after work, they're going to go out for drinks with detectives and with whoever because they're part of the same work ecosystem. if you're going out for drinks with these prosecutors and with these detectives, you don't want them to look bad in court. So yeah, what's a little number fudging for your pals?
Absolutely abysmal. And as we mentioned earlier in this episode, cop drama television is really effective at promoting bad science and idolizing the police. The podcast Citations Needed has gone into really great detail on this. We'll, of course, link their episode in our source list as we usually do. But something about the Glen Woodall case really struck me. So if you remember, the survivor Rebecca Mowry said that even after Woodall had been exonerated, the prosecutors still kept telling her that he was guilty and that he was getting off on a technicality. First, nobody gets off on a technicality. This is just police speak for, we broke the law or trampled on someone's rights during our investigation, and counsel used our impropriety to defend their client. That's not a technicality. That is the law. That's the system.
Yeah, it's just a way for them to deflect from the fact that they fucked up on their own job.
Right, but I can just picture someone like Olivia Benson from Law & Order SVU telling this distraught woman that her attacker is going to walk free on a technicality, and we, the viewer, are meant to empathize completely with the survivor and not at all with the alleged perpetrator. And this is not to say that guilty people don't get away with things all the time. They do. But when law enforcement insists that someone is responsible for a crime even after ample evidence has shown they aren't, that should be concerning to us.
Also, is it just me, or do you notice with these TV shows like Law & Order SVU and CSI and so on, the prosecution is often portrayed in a sort of heroic light, but the defense, whether it's a public defender or a private lawyer, they're always portrayed as these sort of sleazy, sort of corrupt, morally questionable guys who are gonna, the show is built on the premise that the guy they catch is the guilty guy. So once they're in the interrogation room, the premise is that the cops must get the guy to confess or whatever, but then the lawyer is like an obstacle in their way. The defense lawyer, the public...
Yeah, of course.
It's an obstacle to be navigated by the prosecution and by the police to get the evil bad guy. And so it promotes this idea that all these public defenders do is defend real rapists and get them off. They're an obstacle for the prosecution when they're just doing their job. And if the cops can't fucking do their job right, then that should be a lot more concerning to us than public defenders.
Right. There are pretty much two types of lawyers in Law & Order, other than the prosecution. Two types of defense lawyers. There is the bumbling idiot public defender, where the prosecution is like, oh, thank God, we're going to convict this poor person and put them in prison, haha. And then there is the high-end defense lawyer, and this high-end defense lawyer helps this rich guy who we're meant to hate get away with rape or murder. And we're all supposed to be like, wow, defense lawyers are the worst people ever. They are the people who are sicking rapists and murderers upon our society. And without them, things would be so much better.
Yeah, and the converse of that being we should give cops and prosecutors more power to stop those evil defense lawyers from getting away with it.
Yeah, and they always paint civil rights abuses as some sort of loophole. So the cops will violate the Fourth Amendment, which says that they can't search your home without a warrant. And then when the defense rightfully points this out and gets the evidence thrown out, they're like, wow, off on a technicality, legal loophole. It's not a loophole. It is the law. The police broke the law.
It's there for a reason. Those laws are there to protect people and their civil liberties, for fuck's sake.
So the discussion of SVU leads us to another point. You probably noticed that many of these wrongful convictions involved sexual assault, and this could in part just be due to the nature of such crimes. A rapist is more likely to leave semen at a crime scene than a carjacker, for instance, but...
Unless that carjacker is, what's his name? The guy who was... the guy who was...
A carjacker jacker.
Yeah. First of all, I'm actually really impressed that you thought of that pun before me. But I was thinking specifically of the guy who was dating that Munchausen by proxy's daughter. Fuck, what's his name?
Nicholas Godejohn?
Yeah, that's the one. Mr. 9 Hours at McDonald's. King.
Ew. Oh my God. But We both think that there's something else going on here as well.
Yeah, so we briefly discussed this in our 4th episode of Current Criminal, but some assaults which are more vicious than others, like rape and especially violent stranger rape, prompt these very emotional reactions in us. We're afraid of something like that happening to us or someone we love. And those reactions are very normal. But the problem, however, is when such emotional responses are weaponized by the police and prosecution to convict innocent people. So when presented with an uncommonly horrific crime and then told by a prosecutor that the defendant is most probably guilty, jurors are less likely to consider the reasonable doubt presented by the defense team. They fear that if this person is guilty, it's too dangerous to set them free.
Yeah, this is a very psychological phenomenon where if you are presented with someone and saying this person likely attacked a child, you don't want to be a person or part of a jury that lets that person go free, even if you have some inkling that they didn't do it, because the thought is, what if we set them free and they are guilty and they do it again?
Yeah, for them, the incentive is not so much, what if this person is innocent and we're sending them to jail, but the inverse. What if this person is guilty and we're setting them free?
And prosecutors know that and take advantage of that. And the courtroom is just as much a stage as it is a venue for justice, or maybe isn't a venue for justice, given what we're talking about. You aren't there to prove scientifically that this person is guilty. You are there to convince the jurors that this person is guilty. And that's a distinction that's actually really important.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I'm getting the details of this wrong, but I know vaguely that, like, in any criminal case, both the prosecution and defense have to agree on the jury selection. Like, they go through some sort of process, right?
Yeah, that's true.
In that case, like, I'm sure the prosecution and the defense, and obviously, like, they have incentives to pick particular jurors that they know are emotionally in some way gonna veer in their favor, whether it's like same race identification, whatever psychological phenomena are there that would allow the juror to lean in their direction. And the prosecution know that with particularly violent or horrific crimes, they can play to the jurors' emotional buttons and get the guilty verdict, regardless of whether the person is innocent or not, based on the horror of the crime, because the jurors are more likely to be psychologically worried about whether the person is guilty and thus free.
Yeah, that's true. And I also find it really interesting that crusaders against false rape allegations seem to focus most of their attention on women and not on law enforcement literally fabricating evidence to frame people. You never see them going, I care very deeply about people wrongfully convicted of sex crimes, which is why I donate to the Innocence Project. They never say that.
Yeah, they never talk about abolishing the police or like the justice system, or like, because for them it's just a vehicle for misogyny. It's just like a wolf in sheep's clothing. They want to hate women.
Right, and it's definitely worth noting that the survivors mentioned at the beginning of this episode, Rebecca and Janet, did not accuse Glen Woodall of rape. They reported that a stranger raped them, and then the police pinned the crime on Woodall. And because of this, not only was Woodall wrongfully incarcerated, but the survivors had to cope with the feeling that their attacker was found and then learn that he wasn't actually guilty and go through the whole ordeal of a second trial and know that this horrible, horrible thing that happened to them has even spread out and hurt other people. None of us want to see sexual predators get away with violence. Of course, we want people held accountable for the pain they have caused, but for that reason, we refuse to accept a system where innocent people are consistently persecuted, and the people who do cause harm, like Fred Zain and Joyce Gilchrist and all their little pig friends, don't face any repercussions. We leave you with a quote from Alex S. Vitel's The End of Policing. Quote, "Yes, communities deserve protection from crime and even disorder, but we must always demand those without reliance on the coercion, violence, and humiliation that undergird our criminal justice system. The state may try to solve those problems through police power, but we should not encourage or reward such short-sighted, counterproductive, and unjust approaches. We should demand safety and security, but not at the hands of the police. In the end, they rarely provide either. End quote.
That is a very poignant quote, and I think it's a great way to close things. And with closing, I just want to remind our listeners that next week we are releasing our bonus content for free and asking you that you donate to Black activists and causes, or perhaps the Innocent Project or the Marshall Project, if the content of this episode inspires you. Also, our Monday episodes will always be free, so please subscribe and look out for those.
Yeah, make sure you share with your friends. Share this episode in particular with anyone who uncritically lionizes law enforcement or says stuff like, if you don't want to land in trouble, don't break the law. Fucking stop saying that. We also want to send a thanks to our Patreon supporters, Tim, Meher, Fatma, Diarmid, and of course my mom. You can follow us on Instagram at Das Criminal Pod, and anything you want us to discuss on the pod, be it a case or an article you found or something you want us to take a look at, like an event or an issue in your country, just let us know. We always try our best to take on pretty much anything that's sent our way in good faith. So just message us on Instagram or on Patreon and say, take a look at this case, and we will.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for continuing to listen and support us. Thanks. Until next time, everyone.
Yep, sending solidarity to protesters.
Likewise. Bye.
Bye.